Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? This week we have Nobel nominations for the development of a patent-free vaccine, an increase in Streptococcus A infections that are causing issues, a somewhat ridiculous lawsuit regarding a gay couple whose surrogate gave birth to a daughter. The Supreme Court has refused to hear the case of a woman who was unvaccinated and therefore not eligible for organ transplant. The effect that hurricanes have in pushing heat deep down into the ocean, unusual behavior by orcas, weird research misconduct that covers a variety of different actions, some more significant than others, Intel developing a new processor that they claim is intended to make quantum technology more accessible, and finally, Astronomers' role in legal proceedings. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. Let's start with the Nobel Prize nomination for development of a low-cost or patent-free vaccine. The Nobel Prizes are basically Nobel's effort to mitigate his development of TNT and the consequential loss of life. They're million-dollar prizes, which, honestly, the money's not why they're awarded. It's the prestige of being recognized for doing something so amazing. In this case, it's the COVID-19 vaccine, and understand it is only a nomination, not the actual award, that is intended to make vaccines available to developing countries where they don't necessarily have that option now. The fundamental problem is that big companies like Pfizer, Moderna, and so on don't really have an interest in, making vaccines for developing countries, and this is simply because, the market share isn't worth it. There's no practical reason for it. If you are already making a vaccine, then yeah, a lot of developed countries put aside money specifically to basically buy vaccines to ship to these developing countries, and so there's no major loss there. COVID-19 is a slight exception to that rule, more so because it's something that's somewhat outdated now and therefore has to be remade and rebuilt several times over. The key individuals to this are Maria Elena Bottazzi and Dr Hotez. Both are doctors of a kind, and this is not necessarily why they're famous. Their work before this made them famous, and they're more famous this week, at least in the case of Hotez, due to the ridiculous debacle with Joe Rogan, RFK Jr., and the demand that science should be debated by a comedian moderator. No. The Texas Tribune article has a lot more detail on Corbavax, the vaccine that was developed, and all of the technology and work that went into it, and the link is below if you'd like to read up on it. Next we have news on Japan, and the interesting changes or differences between cultures, notably how many people in Japan are continuing to wear a mask, even though it's no longer a requisite, and it's largely there to protect themselves and others. Unlike America, most of Europe, Australia, Canada, countries that have a primarily Western mentality or culture, mask wearing is far more common in Japan if you either suspect you're ill or you are ill. To a degree, you can almost say it's a degree of personal responsibility where the individual looks after themselves and the community as a whole. The difference in culture may explain some of what we're seeing with, in the West at least, a far bigger pushback against mask wearing, whereas in Japan, people continue to wear them frequently at 76% in crowded transport, the supermarket or convenience store, 62% of public transport, and still high rates in other places. For example, indoors at the workplace, at restaurants, and nearly 80% in hospitals still. Interestingly, there was a slight, deviation amongst young people between 15 and 19 years of age. The reason nearly 50% of respondents wear a mask is that they were embarrassed and did not want others to see their face. This is not necessarily a major discovery, as the differences between societies were already fairly well known, but it's an interesting observation and demonstration of this variation between culture. Next we have the increase in Streptococcus A, and why doctors are worried about this. Strep throat, which is primarily caused by Streptococcus A, is increasingly common, and as a general rule, you don't want Streptococcus for anything. It's also the same species responsible for many of the flesh-eating infections that occur. But beyond that, it's also somewhat more difficult to treat, as this particular species of bacteria is generally more resilient, and that's also why the flesh-eating varieties exist. The challenge is that Strep A is far more efficient at getting into the bloodstream, and when that happens, there is hell to pay, because that leads to sepsis, and sepsis doesn't always lead to death, but you have a much higher chance of it. There's also the fact that, well, it's mostly young people and the elderly who are at risk, so that means they are weaker and therefore more likely to experience complications and death. When we talk about that, we need to focus on kids, as kids are especially prone to engaging in actions that will communicate Strep A, and unfortunately Strep A is very contagious. So you need to get on top of it quickly in order to treat it. In other treatment news, we have special nasal drops for stroke recovery. Generally speaking, if you have a stroke, your brain is damaged forever. The reason for this is straightforward. You've cut off blood supply to that part of the brain. Once neurons are dead, they stay dead. For most people. Some people seem to have already had their brain damaged from birth, since, well, they're as good as a potato. For everybody else, a stroke can be life-altering for that reason. You need to rebuild all of the pathways involved. Early treatment or intervention minimizes that damage. This is why the, let's say, treatment of a kind, in the form of drops, might be helpful. The researchers believe that the treatment could be used even if an individual doesn't get treatment as soon as possible. That is, once the damage is permanent. Their theory is, or at least their premise to their treatment is, that those who get the treatment either on time or even afterwards could see improvements in the outcomes they have. This claim is not necessarily unfounded, but it is based on rodent models, so take this with a lot of salt and hope that if you do have a stroke, you're a mouse, not a human. The premise is C3A, which is part of the complement cascade, helps to interfere with the activity of the various leukocytes that are involved. Once you get these leukocytes in there, they're going to increase the amount of inflammation, and unfortunately, inflammation is not necessarily helpful in this instance. By delaying the activity of those cells, they were able to increase the number of connections that neurons made in the brain of the mice given the treatment. This, at least in theory, means that you have a better chance of developing or recovering brain function than without. Of course, the other caveat to that is that, well, it's not an invasive treatment by comparison to the thrombolectomy, or literally inserting some sort of catheter into the necessary parts of the brain to break up the clot, using some sort of thrombolytic compound. In less impressive clinical news, and also related to litigation, we have a gay couple who is intending on suing the surrogate mother who gave birth to a daughter because, well, they wanted a son. Beyond the simple fact that there's very little means of controlling the sex of an offspring unless you are willing to undergo rather unpleasant procedures repeatedly to eventually get a male child, the simple reality is that the woman was willing to be a surrogate, which is carrying around a watermelon inside their abdomen for 9 months. Suing them because they didn't get what they want is just plain nasty. Beyond the fact that the doctor responsible for this made promises that honestly may have well and truly been overblown, in that they assured the couple they could have a male child and that they could ensure the IVF child was male, they also had to have the surrogate undergo multiple rounds of treatment in order to become pregnant. In further emerging and growing news, we have other embryonic news. The development of a synthetic human embryo. That is, it has no need for either sperm or eggs originating from a human. This is going to circumvent a lot of issues around things like ovum and sperm that have been either abandoned or left to be donated to this sort of research by those who have been undergoing IVF therapy or similar. The whole premise of this is very similar to the news we had a while back on that around 2 male mice giving rise to a completely viable embryo. And it's all about stem cells and turning the stem cells or culturing it into a, traditional embryo. Understand that this information is very early on, as in the actual research hasn't been properly published, reviewed, or more importantly, peer-reviewed. As such, we're only able to rely on the early information available from the University of Cambridge, but what they have described fits with prior research. They're able to get the cells involved to initially turn into a yolk sac, a placenta, and then the actual embryo itself, so it's in line with everything else we'd expect to see. The only problem with what we're seeing with this is that there's no brain or heart, which are kind of important if you're trying to create an actual living being. This is both a literal and metaphorical brain and heart, in that they don't have either the soul or mind, heart and brain, nor the actual organs, which means that these are entirely model-based structures, which might be useful when we're looking at, let's say, pathologies, where you're going to have complications of multiple different systems in play. More immediately, the research would be more important for research into fertility, and why it is that a lot of pregnancies have problems at this stage of development, as this is what's being recreated by this model. The development of this embryonic model does raise 2 rather significant ethical concerns. The first is that it is a workaround to the existing rules regarding 14 days. That is, embryonic research using human-derived cells, specifically ovum and sperm, should only allow an embryo to be cultured for 14 days. This is basically to avoid issues around it actually becoming something approaching a human and not just a lump of cells. By using stem cells this way, it technically doesn't fit into any existing framework, and therefore there's no box to tick to say that this should be bound by the 14-day rule. The second, slightly more questionable or hypothetical scenario is, the Matrix. How is it that they made humans, and this could be the answer? In legal clinical news, we have developments in Canada. A Canadian woman needed an organ transplant, and she was at the top of the list and eligible to receive it, except for one thing: she hadn't been vaccinated for COVID-19. As a result, she was rejected. The reason is simple enough. All individuals receiving a transplanted organ need to be in the best possible health, have the best possibility of survival, and have the minimum possibility of complications. This is to ensure that the person who receives the organ, which can only be used once, is going to make the best use of it. Whereas there's not enough organs to go around, so those who aren't going to do that obviously get pushed further down the list. There's also issues around urgency, the priority of who does what, and similar, but overall, it's fundamentally not enough organs, too many people need it, you need to use the strictest criteria to decide who gets what. Because she was unvaccinated for COVID-19, this could have all easily been solved, and that is simply being vaccinated for it. But she refused. This eventually led to lawsuits, and as you can imagine, since this went as far as the Supreme Court, they weren't successful. The Supreme Court has refused to hear the case, and to be quite blunt, for very simple reasons. There is little reason to change the rules given the current situation, that is, they exist to make best use of a limited resource for the people most likely to benefit from it in the long run. Damned be the individual considerations of each person. In fact, the court recognizes this when they say, it is a virtual certainty that she will die without an organ transplant. As harsh as it is to say, this is a reasonable decision. The simple reality is that individuals who donate their organs are making a significant donation. Whilst no, it's not their life, it certainly was a part of their life. And unlike, say, a house, this is something that can be only donated once and then it's gone. It's also something literally from their own body. While as the expression, giving someone the shirt off your own back, which is to say you literally give them the very maximum of things you can possibly do, so much as to sacrifice your own comfort. This isn't even that. This goes further. And that is why hospitals and health services prioritize the best possible health outcomes to ensure that individuals who receive the donation can have the best benefit and out of respect for the donor. Shifting to environmental news, and we have interesting developments around octopi. Or should it be octopuses? Debate that one in the comments section. The octopus is an interesting creature. Beyond the reproductive nature of them, there's also bizarre behavior when it comes to their DNA. There are two distinct populations of the Turkot's octopus in Antarctica, and they fundamentally are exactly the same species, just slightly separated by geography. However, those two populations are deviating from each other. That deviation is a sign that at some point there was a very clear channel for the two to travel between their habitats, and this is an indication that the Antarctic ice sheet pathway, specifically the West Antarctic ice sheet, may well open up, and that would be a problem. Not necessarily because it's a problem with the break itself, but what it's going to allow to flow freely. It's a massive ice sheet that would raise the ocean levels by about 65 centimeters, or somewhere around 2 feet. In other news that's related to the oceans, we have hurricanes. Hurricanes being massive storms that cause havoc for everybody and everything. However, they also play a big role in shifting heat from the atmosphere deep into the ocean. Yeah, it's one of these bizarre phenomena, but the ability to not only demonstrate but understand what's happening is what's important here. The study roughly describes it as being able to churn the surface of the ocean so significantly that it captures the heat, and that forces it down further and further into the oceans. And of course, the oceans are effectively giant heat sinks. So the more heat you put in there, the more it will be sustained. And this means you can keep heat in the oceans for years because of the way hurricanes work. Of course, the mixing isn't just at a surface level. Rather, because we have the combination of the huge pressure from the hurricane, we have the multiple layers of clouds, churning, and other activities, it pushes the heat 4 times deeper into the ocean than simply mixing it at a surface level would. The important part of this is not necessarily that we're seeing the water being kept in the ocean. That's a problem at a local level and could have an impact. Rather, it's that that warm ocean water is carried much further away through currents, and so, say, a hurricane near the Philippines could increase ocean temperatures as far away as Ecuador, admittedly months and months later, but still. In other long-lasting news, we have a parasite that increases the lifespan of an ant. The ant is called the Ctenothorax nylandri. The parasite that increases its lifespan is, well, the tapeworm. Admittedly, it is the Nominatenia brevis, but because of its infection by this tapeworm, some of the ants who have it live considerably longer, up to 3 times longer than their other comparative peers. The lifetime of these ants, however, would have to be very boring, as they don't actually do any work. Instead, uninfected ants will do everything for these infected ants, whether that is their work, carrying around, feeding it, or grooming it. They live a pampered and luxurious life. The reason why they live long is not just that they have a very pleasurable life, but rather the tapeworm itself is causing the body to behave differently, largely increasing antioxidant and protein levels in the bloodstream of the ant that's been infected, and this is perhaps what's contributing, not necessarily entirely, to the increased lifespan of the ant itself. The change in behavior, at least as far as secretions and bodily proteins and similar go, is also why the other ants pamper the infected ants. One of the major products is called vitellogenin-like A, and it regulates the behavior of ants around it, particularly when it comes to labor and reproduction. It's kind of like OnlyFans or cam girls and lonely guys. Then we have news on orcas and the increase in aggressive behavior on their part. As we've noted in recent weeks, there's been a rise in the number of attacks for ships with rudders by orcas where they've been damaging them. At least according to the most recent tracking data, these are now occurring on a daily basis. Shifting to academic news and a possible conspiracy of a kind to basically increase the impact of a particular Indian dental school by increasing its rankings through publishing. Unfortunately, most institutions do have the publish or perish mantra fore and center in just about all staff minds. The idea is that the more you publish, the more impact you have, the more you are worth. This is not just a isolated incident, just about all universities and institutions are like this, and it would appear that Savitha Dental College in India wasn't an exception to that. The whole system was to have the 500 undergraduate students who go there write a 1,500-word manuscript on research that they've conducted. Then, after this is done, they're examined on it, and that examined paper is used as a publication. The, let's say, proctors use an online tool which adds references, and this allows them to publish it as their own work. Unfortunately, that also led to 1,400 publications of a dubious nature. The practice is already very questionable and likely ethically wrong, but it gets worse. The major source of citations for these internal publications that were then submitted to journals relies on citing previous work generated the same way. This is not necessarily wrong, but it's generally frowned upon to cite yourself frequently. The general idea is that if you have existing publications and you're building on them, you cite them, but you don't cite your own work across your own publications if it's not directly building on it. You look at what others have done and cite them instead. That's not what happened here. Most of those generated citations for these manuscripts were from the same institute, and this artificially inflates its impact. The reason they're able to get away with it the way they have been is that they insert a vague sentence to which they can attach any number of other citations to, thereby not being able to be penalized for inaccurately citing the original research, nor can they really be picked up for it as regularly attributing the same claims to the same papers. That's not the only weird ethical or misconduct-related news in academia. Another has to do with a publication that was talking about how to prompt honest behavior, which ironically is from an article that was retracted because it relied on fraudulent data. Yeah, talk about ridiculous and ironic. The Harvard University publication eventually was identified as containing more fraudulent data than had previously been revealed, which is already a massive red flag. The fact that it's more fraudulent data that's been found through an investigation going on for more than a year now is a worry, since the first fraudulent data should have led to it being retracted. Of course, the academics involved have denied any direct responsibility for this and have attributed responsibility to various other factors, whether that is lack of their oversight for staff members, other staff members doing something, or more reasons yet again. The last bit of academic news we have is an interesting article from Quillette, and it talks about a publication from 2020. Specifically, a publication that was retracted. Now, normally this would be grounds for criticizing the academics involved, largely because, well, they would have done something dodgy. But no, in this instance, it was retracted seemingly due to pressure from the political spectrum, not due to an academic problem. The simplified version of the article in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, or PNAS, is all about whether or not law enforcement is more likely to shoot people of different ethnic or cultural backgrounds. For example, would a police officer shoot a black person or a white person in more probability? They found that it was less likely that a black person would be shot by a police officer, but not necessarily significantly so. This isn't really consistent with the recent Overton window shift, where the accusation is that police are more likely to shoot black people because they're bored, or some other ridiculous argument. The problem is, data has not historically supported this argument, no matter what gets claimed. The reason the Quillette article argues that this is all due to politics is twofold. The first is simply that this research was repeatedly cited by more right-leaning political representatives to support the argument that police aren't racially justified in what they're doing and that there isn't necessarily a racial injustice to how they're enforcing law, or at least for those who get shot. The second is the various, well, let's be blunt, editorial amendments and statements made around the article. Specifically, that the editors of PENUS say, "The problem that exists now, however, is outside the realm of science. It has to do with the misinterpretation and partisan political use of scientific articles after publication." It's an uncomfortably clear statement from the editorial board saying, this doesn't fit with our preconceived notion of how the world works, therefore it needs to be retracted. This is not to say the study was necessarily without a fault, and to be clear about it, it's a fault solely in that the language used was perhaps more explicit than should have been used, and that all boils down to the summary of what the article found. The correction reads, "As the proportion of white officers in a fatal officer-involved shooting increased, a person fatally shot was not more likely to be of a racial minority." So that's pretty clear. The original read, "White officers are not more likely to shoot minority civilians than non-white officers." This is slightly too explicit in some respects, primarily because you could misconstrue it to mean that in all circumstances this is true, rather than just in fatal shootings, which was the difference here. But the reason Quillette concludes that it's political is that that sort of statement was made by other articles, that is, the more vague and possibly misconstrued understanding that weren't cited by the same people who were citing this article. However, there was no correction, and to a slightly more important extent, retraction of the other article, which was only published a month or two before, despite making these same problems, just not being used by these same people. The article goes through other issues involved with this. For instance, the lead editor of PENUS was apparently involved in some of the debacle that we're talking about, and as such, it's kinda hard not to see that there might be more going on than is necessarily comfortable for something claiming to be a peer-reviewed journal that's publishing scientific findings rather than political information. In a related bit of news, we have developments in Ireland, and that new law may, at least in theory, make it possible to be jailed for hate speech. And yeah, this is one of those possibly minefield-laden issues. The simple version of this is that, much like Bill C-16 in Canada, it would make the gender identity of an individual a protected characteristic or class. As uncomfortable as it is to say, description of this as an Orwellian law isn't actually that far off. And that's because some of the, let's say, carve-outs or terms in this are very specific and very worrying. The major consideration is that if you have material that might cause hatred or offense, but you don't necessarily disseminate it, you just simply have possession of it, is enough to get you in trouble under this law.
If the government ever searched my house, you would be the least of my problems. You trusted me. It would be terrible manners for me not to trust you.
Oh my god.
Very much like something in V for Vendetta, where simply having a copy of the Quran is enough to get you in trouble. Some of the politicians most in support of this law have said that it's right to restrict people's freedom of speech to protect vulnerable people from discomfort. The very fact that this law is making people uncomfortable or discomforted is probably an irony that has escaped them. Unfortunately, like Bill C-16 in Canada, this is a very poorly structured bit of legislation. That is because they have failed to define some of their key terms. For example, hatred. If you don't have definitions within the law, you now have to start looking in random places to figure out whether or not something like a dissent as to whether or not males are males and females are females, or can males breastfeed, are, well, hatred in this case. In less controversial news, we have Intel's intention to try and make quantum technology far more readily available. At the moment, any attempt at quantum computing is basically limited to either the theoretical or incredibly small numbers of labs, and that's because the technology is so expensive, hard to make, and honestly so niche in its applications that otherwise it would be unneeded, and you would have no reason to have it. But quantum computing, given the huge advance it would be in, well, computing power, is going to be the next big step, and so the more people who can use it, the better. Intel intends to try and do this by building their quantum computer, at least this generation, on what you could consider conventional silicon setups. That is very much like your modern processor for a computer, albeit significantly more powerful, but still much more similar and a lot easier to transform and transfer from than jumping straight to quantum computing. It would make the transition very simple and very easy. The other advantage to this is that it doesn't involve a complete retooling and resetting up of Intel's production methods. This means Intel can continue to produce their current line of, well, inferior products, whilst also starting production of these new, frankly, premium products. Finally, we have this bizarre but interesting article talking about how astronomers are vital to legal proceedings. The article from The Conversation looks at this as being very similar to forensics evidence. That is, the role the astronomer plays in providing witness testimony and reporting, where the same sort of thing would occur for someone talking about DNA, and the probability that the defendant or accused is likely to be this, that, or the other. The article goes into various applications of this, whether that is something as mundane as what sort of light conditions were around at the time of something, or slightly more specific as to the probability that the sun was actually shining directly into someone's face, thereby temporarily blinding them when they were driving, for instance. No matter which or what of the options available, you need someone to not only provide the report, but be able to be questioned on the validity, methods, and veracity of that report, and it's what the article talks about. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.